This is nice, isn't it? Lovely sunny day. Off a nice drive somewhere. Just one problem. It's the 70s.
The men's morale is still high.
It's time to re-entry. At this point, there's very little anybody can do, including the astronauts, except wait.
Marking the decline of the British Empire. The Beatles are breaking up.
The 1970s kicked off optimistically, with Pan Am launching the first Boeing air flight between New York and London. You might have been forgiven for thinking after the 1960s that the 1970s were shaping up to be the best decade in human history. However, by the end of 1979, so much shit had happened that there literally isn't time for me to go through it all with you, and this clip of Bob Hope being accosted on the stage of the Miss World contest in 1970 officially qualifies as light relief, so enjoy it while you can. 1970 was an election year in the United Kingdom, so that should be where we start. But just before we get to June, I'd like to jump back to May and give honourable mention to Bobby Moore getting arrested at the 1970 World Cup for allegedly stealing a bracelet.
Tell us how you feel, Bobby.
Like an English hero, I'd imagine. Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson called the election in 1970 confident of victory. The Labour Party were ahead in all the polls, and the outcome of the election seemed a foregone conclusion.
Now, during the night, the crowd here will be able to watch the results not only in this present carnival atmosphere, but in new status-conscious style, choosing between two of the largest colour television sets in the country. There they are, side by side, like rival booths in the same fairground.
So the Conservatives have taken this seat.
And this really is the seat of Mrs. Winfred Ewing, who won it in a by-election.
I am not only now the Member of Parliament for the Bandside, but the Member of Parliament for North Antrim. And I would like to thank the loyalists of North Antrim for giving me this magnificent vote. Traditional unionism and to the principles on which this great province of ours was founded. Principles that we shall never surrender.
John Enoch Powell, 26,200.
made me their representative in Parliament. And I promise to serve them all. I promise to serve them all to the best of my ability. I was going to say I was going to go to bed, but
well, yes,
evidently that wasn't what you meant.
You're very fortunate if you can.
Well, I can,
I should stay up and watch. We've got a good programme here.
This is Enoch Powell. In 1968, he was expelled from the Conservative shadow cabinet for making what has become known as the Rivers of Blood speech. He is going to have an important part to play as the story of the 70s progress, but for right now, he's a Conservative backbencher with a lot of popular support.
No, I shan't do that.
But in Parliament, what are your plans?
Well, I'd like to see this Parliament first, but I'm sure I shall enjoy myself.
May we...
Taking away the moments that make up the day.
Police ill, police being very gentle about it. The hours in our fan way. The fact of the matter is, they're all standing up there shouting Enoch Powell.
Thinking around on a piece of
I must stop your number 10. Removal of van arrival. Here's removal van arriving.
waiting for someone or something to show you the way.
Quiet now, please. Have you finished?
Prime Minister, when we spoke early this morning, you refused to concede that the election was lost. Do you now accept that the chance of your being Prime Minister by this evening is very remote?
Since we spoke...
Harold Wilson had been left shocked and humiliated by the defeat. He had expected to increase his majority and instead he had to leave office. Publicly, he spoke with respect about Ted Heath, but privately he was embarrassed that he had lost to a man he felt was his intellectual inferior. Harold will be coming back into the story. He's just taking a short break to smoke his pipe and gather his thoughts.
Victory then, until that figure was reached, and I shall treat it in the same way as he did.
But to all intents and purposes, you've now given up any hope of...
Well, I think the figures speak for themselves.
When do you expect to go to the palace?
That I don't know.
Could we look at the campaign just for a moment? What are your feelings this morning towards Mr. Heath? Did you admire him as an opponent?
You know, I've always admired him, and I've said this a number of times, much more than many other people, even in his own party. I've always felt that if he could be himself and not have to be pushed around by publicity people and so on, that he would have come through very much earlier and much more clearly. As an opponent in the election, I didn't very much like his style on many questions, and you know, I spoke out very clearly about his attempt to drag Sterling into the campaign. But
Can we hear your formal claim of the Prime Ministership and leadership of the country now? Mr. Heath. Can we hear you? Are you... Mr. Heath, are you leaving the formal claim until you get to central office? Mr. Heath, are you leaving the formal claim until you get to central office?
Ted's time in office would be defined by two things. One is the unions, and we'll get to them in a minute. The other is Europe. Britain had been trying to join the European Economic Community since 1962. Prime Ministers Harold Macmillan and Harold Wilson had both been refused entry by French President Charles de Gaulle, who thought Britain was incompatible with Europe. De Gaulle resigned in 1969 and the path was clear for Britain to finally join the EEC.
The chair waited for Mr. Heath to get his £40,000 prize for European statesmanship. This is the embryo of a future European Parliament. When Mr. Heath went in, he was entering a building which was Europe's first enthusiastic response to Winston Churchill's call after the war to build a United States of Europe, his call to recreate the European family. There's now renewed interest in Europe on what Mr. Heath and Britain, once in the common market, will do to influence or reinvigorate these flagging institutions, which were the first enthusiastic projections of the European ideal.
After 10 years of trying, Britain's entry into the European community was seen as something to celebrate. Politicians from the three main parties flew out to Brussels to watch the treaty being signed, including former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who had first applied in 1962. But as Prime Minister Heath was entering the building to sign the treaty, this happened. Heath changed his suit and the treaty was signed.
The leaders of Europe have met the press after each chapter in Brussels to explain, defend or deplore Britain's exclusion from the common market. From now on, it's going to be different.
If you give them the opportunity to say, oh, he's the European guy, he looks after them, and I just carry on in my own sweet way, that's great.
It's just a silly face.